First and foremost, I want to thank you for coming on the platform. This is definitely an honor. I truly appreciate you taking out the time to come by and share some of the history of the work that you've been doing.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, so thanks.
For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
So I am Professor Steve Hinshaw. I'm actually a distinguished professor of psychology at University of California, Berkeley, and I'm also a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. And I do a lot of work with kids and teens and young adults and mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD and treatments and causes and outcomes. And I'm also, in my second line of work, really interested in reducing the stigma and discrimination that still unfortunately attach themselves to people with mental and neurodevelopmental conditions.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Now I can ask you this: when did you develop a passion for, psychology and mental illness? Was this something that you got into early on in life, or did you develop a passion for it later on?
Well, the answer is both C, both of the above. So when I was a little boy, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and my dad was a professor of philosophy at Ohio State. My mom was a lecturer in English. And we had this great upbringing close to campus, great public schools. But my dad would disappear for months, at one point, a year at a time. And mom wasn't allowed to tell us, my sister and I, where he was. And no letters, no phone calls, no postcards. And so I didn't know if he was alive or dead. And then mysteriously one day he'd just be back and no one, no party, no greeting. And it wasn't until my teen years that I understood when he disclosed to me that his disappearances landed him in some of the country's worst old fashioned snake pit mental hospitals for what they thought was schizophrenia, which began when he was 16. It turned out to be manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. I really got him the diagnosis just after I finished college because I put two and two together. But his own doctor back in Ohio said, Professor Hinshaw, if your children ever learn of your mental illness and your hospitalizations, they'll be destroyed permanently. So you and your wife, the kid's mother, you're never allowed to talk about it. They'll be destroyed. So the doctor's orders were mental illness was such a toxic presence, couldn't even discuss it. So I, as a boy, kept quiet. I could see the look in mom's eyes. Don't ask any more questions. And when dad was back, well, gee, if I ask about where you've been for the last year or half year, maybe he'd go away again. And so when kids are confronted with a really tough family situation, number one, I guess you can believe the world's just kind of an awful, random, cruel place, not very healthy or happy. Or number two, you can sort of form the belief that maybe it's my fault. Maybe I did something wrong. You internalize it. And so I kept thinking it must be something I was doing wrong. Once, when I was 17 going on 18, I wasn't a kid anymore. So he came out of the closet and told me about his life's experiences with hearing voices and seeing visions and jumping off the roof of his family home in Pasadena, California when he was a teenager, thinking this flight would save the world from Hitler and Mussolini. And wow, I thought there must have been something pretty bad for the silence to have been so big. So I was a freshman in college and I went back and changed my major to psychology and figured out it's probably a good idea to learn about mental illness and help kids and families. And so I began my career as a clinical psychologist and a professor.
Oh, okay. Wow. It seems like it turned out negative, but it empowered you and inspired you to go on to do great work. You spoke about combating the stigmatism
Yeah.
that, kind of comes with talking or seeking help for mental illness. If you could speak about that, the work that you actually have done and working with people, and what have you found once you actually, did your own research?
So bipolar disorder, which my dad had, schizophrenia, PTSD, ADHD, or learning disorders in kids, or autism spectrum disorder. Um, there are strengths in many such people, but over time, many people suffer a lot of impairments. They don't do well in school, relationships are compromised, it's hard to hold a job. And so getting good treatment is really important, not to hide your strengths, but to let them come out. But when you put on top of that, that it's shameful to talk about weakness. What do you mean you hear voices? Or what do you mean you can't control your mood? Or what do you mean you're terrified if a helicopter flies over because you had from the Gulf War, Vietnam War, post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, now the mental disorder and the stigma, 1 + 1 starts to equal 8. Stigma takes away hope. It makes you feel you don't deserve treatment. You don't seek it out. And the mental health psychologists and psychiatrists aren't as valued as surgeons or cardiologists or oncologists, cancer doctors. So when stigma is part of the picture, you feel like you're weak for admitting you got a problem to deal with. You don't seek help, and society still gets away from shutting you out of jobs. Even though it's illegal, the Americans with Disabilities Act prevents discrimination against people with physical or mental disabilities in the workplace or in public. But how are you going to get that job? You don't have that job yet. So do you tell your future boss or not? Do you keep it a secret? And we've been keeping these things secret for so long that individuals and families and society as a whole suffers.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, post COVID, you've been hearing more talk about mental health and,
Yeah.
people getting help and seeking therapy. So I think that is a positive thing, despite, a lot of people lost family members and loved ones. So yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely appreciate the work that you have done. I wanted to
Yeah,
ask you
and
about,
I'll just say
okay, go
about
ahead.
that real quick. We have seen a change in the last couple of years since COVID, hit us hard 4.5 years ago. That when you do surveys of the United States population, people are more accepting of depression than any time before in history. But with another random sample of people, if you talk about drug abuse or addiction, or if you talk about psychotic behavior, schizophrenia, people are less accepting than before. So depression and anxiety, I think it's, athletes, celebrities are coming out, and it's a good thing. But if you're putting those drugs in your system, or if you're hearing voices, that's pretty scary. And there's still a lot of stigma against. So it's a mixed blessing. I think we're doing better in some ways, and we've got a lot of improvement in other ways to do.
Definitely. I appreciate you adding that. Now I can ask you about ADHD. What
Yeah.
exactly is that? Is that considered a mental illness, or is that even in the realm of,
Yeah.
psychology?
So ADHD is the acronym, if you will, the abbreviation for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And years ago, these kids were called hyperkinetic or hyperactive, and it was only boys, and they were running around classrooms, disrupting everyone's learning and driving the teachers crazy. We know today that one of the primary issues is the ability to regulate your attention, to remember things, to pay attention to a multi-part direction, to use your kind of mental powers to get through a day. People with ADHD can be extremely smart, and many are, but organization and planning and, oh, I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. So it's attention, it's problems with impulse control, and in some cases, actual hyperactivity. It turns out that around the world, about 6 to 7% of kids have significant enough symptoms that we give a diagnosis of ADHD. It's a lot higher than that in the US because we're a really achievement driven culture. And sometimes we can use this diagnosis or label for any kind of problems a kid has, and maybe give medications or organize the classroom better. But because you don't want to give unneeded treatment, and because some of the medications used for ADHD can be addictive if they're in the wrong hands, what we've really got to do is tighten up our assessment and make sure that this kid or teen or adult has significant enough problems. And so you got to get a good history, you got to give tests, you've got to get ratings from people in that person's world to make sure that there is a lot of ADHD, because there's a lot of myth going around that everybody's inattentive, everybody's on their devices all the time. And certainly, I think the whole population's attention span is shorter than it used to be, but clinically significant ADHD is largely a product of the genes you inherit from your parents. They explain a lot of it. Some people are kind of born to be very careful and almost compulsive and make sure all the details are right. And some people are just less organized, maybe more spontaneous, but it can be costly.
Wow, wow. Okay, I appreciate you sharing that because I remember when I was in school, you know what I'm saying? That was a big deal. And it's still a big deal, obviously. But
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
said, with the change of technology, everyone is, I guess, kind of adapting.
that's
Everybody's on their
right.
phone now. But I can share this with you. I'm currently in Ghana, I'm in Africa. And what I've noticed is you don't see children with electronics, you don't see children with cell phones or computers. They're still jumping on beds and rolling tires and climbing trees. And obviously, one of the reasons is because of the poverty they can't afford it. But
That's
you
right.
know,
And so
yeah,
there's a big movement in the United States today to really restrict iPhones and apps and social media. You don't use those phones in school. You turn them in at the front desk at the start of the day. You only get it back at the end of the day. But homework comes on those devices, and parents need to reach their kids. So there's a big debate, not only that it's making everybody less attentive, but that also if you're a vulnerable teenager and you're lonely or you're a social outcast and your only social contacts are through social media, it's going to make you even more anxious and depressed. And real friendships, real life interactions, and real life play for kids, not being on a device all day, are a really essential part of a good upbringing.
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Now I wanted to ask you about another one. You were the co-director of the SWAB Dyslexia and Cognitive Diversity Center. What exactly is dyslexia? And if you could talk about, your work and research as well.
So dyslexia is kind of an old Greek term for lexicon, etc., as words. You really have trouble learning to read. Now, all kids speak if they hear any spoken language, unless they've got a very severe neurological impairment. But humans have only been writing and reading for a few thousand years, and we've been a species for 200 and 250,000 years. So when we learn to read, it takes time. I mean, kids fight it in school. Some kids it comes easy, some it's harder. We're using brain systems up here for speech and recognition of patterns that there's no reading center in the brain. We've had to kind of co-opt existing brain regions and learn that these symbols, letters in English, et cetera, pictograms in some Asian languages have meaning and they represent sounds or words. And there's about 5 to 10% of the population of kids around the world who, not because they're not taught, but they are taught well, who have real trouble kind of translating a symbol into a sound and processing sounds really quickly enough to start to understand that that letter or that pictogram represents a sound, a phoneme, or a word. And so that's what's called dyslexia or reading disorder these days. And what happens? Kids feel stupid. I'm trying as hard as I can. Other kids laugh at me because I can't read that sign, or I'm falling behind in my reading, and teachers think I'm just lazy, etc. And so the Dyslexia and Cognitive Diversity Center is supporting research and education of students of all ages and how to work with people with these learning disorders, and training models so that people can learn to read, and not feel stigmatized or stupid or that they're unworthy. Because when you're in a really achievement oriented culture and you don't learn well, a lot of people think, and unfortunately, the person who isn't learning well thinks, must be me. I'm stupid. I'm lazy. I'm unworthy. And that stigma, again, really compounds the whole problem.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you about this. You direct the UCLA UC Berkeley Awareness and Hope Stigma Reduction component of the UCLA Depression Grand Challenge. If you could talk about that, is that something where you actually are working with college students?
Yeah, so through a group called Bring Change to Mind, a nonprofit founded by the actress Glenn Close about 13, 14 years ago, and with colleagues at UCLA, we're working with middle school students and high schoolers and college students. And that big program started at Indiana University, the college version of Bring Change to Mind, to talk about anxiety and depression, and to talk about needing help, and to talk about ways of confronting people who call people retards or stupid or dummies or crazy people, so that we can discuss mental illness and help people get treatment. 75, 80 years ago, in the middle of the last century, if your relative died of cancer, that would never appear in the obituary, because cancer was really stigmatized. It was an illness medical people thought that you brought upon yourself because you'd lost the will to live. So, very blameworthy. And so you'd say, oh, my relative died of natural causes or an unknown illness. Today, cancer is a cause. Breast cancer in women, the most common form, prostate cancer in men, many other forms of cancer. We raise money, we fight cancer. Someone goes in the hospital now for cancer treatment and they get flowers and cards. Someone goes into the hospital for bipolar disorder, depression, and everybody ignores them because there's something wrong with them. The idea is to start young, start with teenagers, college students, open up the discussion, start the conversation, and also do some mental health screenings for high school and college kids so that people can get the help they need before it gets really severe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because I guess sometimes parents take for granted that, although their children are away at college and they may be having the time of their life, they may be going through, like you say, anxiety, depression, and
That's right.
stress, and, things like that.
And everybody gets stressed. I mean, stress is part of life. But your challenge, because you're going for it, is my stress because I don't have the resources or because my genetic nature just doesn't handle stress in the same way. So we need to change the media. There's still too many stories about violent, mentally ill criminals, which is people with mental illness are much more likely to be victimized by violence than to perpetrate it themselves. Um, we need to enforce the laws that make it illegal to discriminate. And we need to start conversations the way we did about cancer 50 years ago, because once everybody's talking about it and once everybody's in the battle, policymakers, governors, presidents, kings and queens can't ignore the issue anymore, because mental illness isn't rare. In your lifetime, in my lifetime, in the lifetimes of everybody, over half the population is going to have either a mild or moderate or severe form of mental illness, and it's in every family in the land. So we're we're shortchanging our humanity and we're shortchanging our economies by excluding people. It's a disservice.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, you made some great points. Now I can ask you this: out of all of your decades and years of research, have you ever thought about doing a documentary or any type of film project?
Well, funny you should mention it. Some people with a group called Sharpen, which is doing digital technologies to help teens with mental health problems. They've been filming me for the last 15, 16 years since I wrote a book called The Triple Bind: Saving Our Teenage Girls from Today's Pressures. And they announced to me a few months ago that they were ready to start filming a documentary about my work in mental health and in stigma. And I said, what documentary? And they said, well, we've been sort of half planning this all along. So now we're going around to different places, students of mine, colleagues of mine, trying to spread the word about what especially if you've had it in yourself, and I've had my share of depressions and in my family, and especially if you're into educating the public, not just teaching the facts about depression, but teaching empathy, because so many people go through these experiences. So that documentary's in progress. And then the book I wrote a few years ago now, called Another Kind of Madness: A Journey Through the Stigma and Hope of Mental Illness, which is my family story, especially about my dad, and a very smart philosophy professor who had periodic bouts of being totally irrational, hearing voices, thinking he could save and change the world in very irrational ways. And that's again what we started out talking about. That was my inspiration for not being silent any longer, getting the word out. And so we're hoping that either a series or a film can be made out of that project as well.
Wow, that would be amazing. I would definitely love to see that in the film. Now, how long did it take you to actually write something like that? Because it was about your life, you know, it wasn't like
Well,
a,
when I write a lot of articles because I publish in academic and clinical journals, and I teach a lot of students, and I can write an article, fairly quickly. To write Another Kind of Madness took me 7 years. I had to go deep. Why was I so lonely as a kid? Why did dad disappear? Wait a minute, you mean he had a mental illness that no one could talk about? And how did my whole family change and become more open? So when you go deep, you don't write that in a day or three or a week or three. So now that we're trying to develop kind of narratives for the documentary and a possible film, I'm working with some teams that are trying to express that to an audience that might appreciate rather than in book form, because uh, everybody watches Netflix these days and everybody watches YouTube these days. It'd be nice to get this message out to a wider population.
yeah, yeah, definitely would, definitely it would. Now, do you have any other books available, or are you in the process of, creating any other books?
Well, I've written 11 other books. Some are about ADHD in girls. Some are about the general topic of stigma. Um, some are for a more academic audience, some for a more general audience. If you Google Amazon and look up Steve Hinshaw, Another Kind of Madness, or Steve Hinshaw books, you can find them. And the goal is to teach clinicians and scientists, and also the general public, about the real stories behind. Science is great, knowing what meds work, knowing what therapies work. That's going to change the game. But we have to start with even telling our life stories accurately and honestly, because otherwise it's us versus them. Those people with schizophrenia, those drug addicts, versus knowing that, do you know anybody, Taye, who's perfectly normal? I don't. There's no such thing as being perfectly normal. We're all on a continuum of uh, how structured we are and how loose we are, how organized our thinking is and disorganized, et cetera, et cetera. And many forms of mental disorder are just being on the extremes of those ends of the continuum. And many such people have a lot to contribute to society if they can get the help they need, and if they can talk about it and not feel so ashamed that they shy away from treatment altogether.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Because it seems like a lot of times, like you had mentioned, having empathy, some people feel like, well, if you're successful or you rich or you a
Yeah, yeah,
celebrity,
yeah.
they don't understand why you would be stressed out about anything or depressed or going through these things.
And some of our athletes, look at Simone Biles, who didn't win the gold back in Tokyo 3 years ago because she was dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression and had the courage to talk about it. And now her comeback in 24, the best gymnast in history. And so that's wonderful. Michael Phelps, the swimmer, many actors, Robert Downey Jr. with his history of addiction, et cetera, et cetera. But if the only people who talk about it are famous celebrities, a lot of people will feel, well, I'll never be like that. I'm just Steve normal here, or maybe not so normal. And so this is why we're doing the work with the middle schools and high schools and colleges. If everybody is aware that we're all vulnerable, and some more vulnerable than others, depending on our family histories, mental illness runs in some families more than others, the more we feel open to talk about it and get support, it helps not only you and me, but everybody. If we have a society where it's so shameful to talk about it, nobody gets any help, the whole ship goes down.
True indeed, true indeed. Now I can ask you about this. You mentioned earlier you was from Ohio. I don't know if I said this already. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and I guess
You know,
last year
I've
in
heard some
Ohio.
of your podcasts and I realized that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you. I believe in Ohio last year they legalized, was it recreational use of marijuana? And you've been hands on with a lot of research with mental illness. Have you had any findings that it could be helpful in any capacity to anyone going through any of the things that you mentioned?
So I'm going to answer it in a couple, three ways. Number one, uh, psychedelics, MMDA, mushroom, weed, marijuana, THC. We haven't been able to really study their psychotherapeutic effects because they've been illegal substances. So I think it's a good thing to open up to research. That's number one. Number two, a lot of teens who are anxious and depressed and maybe have ADHD as well, you temporarily feel better when you're high. That anxiety goes away. You're kind of in a different zone, right? But the problem is, especially if you have a learning condition or ADHD, the active ingredient in marijuana, weed, THC, doesn't help your learning. It makes you somewhat more disorganized. So you can get a false sense you're chiller, but you're really not learning the way you could be. And now, number three, if you have a family history of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, other psychotic disorders, and early in your teen years, you start to use a lot of marijuana, there's a big risk that you're going to start to develop a psychosis yourself. It's almost as if the chemicals in THC, if your genes are aligned in a somewhat different way than other people's genes, that psychosis may come out. So it's not a panacea. Certainly for glaucoma, certainly for some physical conditions and pain relief. There's some good evidence for marijuana use. But to say that every, especially young person in the world, should start getting high because that's going to solve their mental health problems, that's way too simple and maybe misguided.
Definitely, definitely. I really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, you gave a lot of information and I'm still processing it, but it's definitely needed. And I'm glad we had this conversation.
Yeah.
I do want to thank you again, for coming on the show. It's been definitely an honor. And I appreciate all the work that you have done over the years. And I definitely look forward to the work that you have coming in the future.
Well, I hope there's a lot more years. There's a lot more to do. And I really appreciate your spending the time interviewing me, Taye.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I want to thank the viewers for tuning in as well. So until next time, peace.
Take care.